Stop wasting fuel on corpses. Colonel Thomas Whitaker slammed his pen down on the casualty report and stamped one word across Claire Bennett's name, KIA, before her body had even gone cold in his mind. Don't waste resources chasing ghosts, he snapped at the officer who dared argue for one more search sweep, then tore the map off the wall and crushed it into the trash. 6 soldiers erased in under a minute because one man decided their lives weren't worth the risk. He had no idea the woman he just buried alive was about to walk out of that mountain and make him regret every second of it. Subscribe now, stay to the end, and tell me your city in the comments. The helicopter did not crash so much as it was unmade. 1 second, Captain Ryan Caldwell was watching Frost crawl across the window glass, counting the minutes until they'd clear the ridgeline. The next second, the world tipped sideways, and the engine screamed a sound no engine should ever make. And then there was no up or down at all, only noise and metal folding like paper, and someone's voice, his own voice, he would realize later, shouting a word that didn't mean anything. Then there was snow in his mouth, and blood in his eyes, and silence so total it felt like a hand pressed flat against his ears. "Sound off," Ryan tried to yell it. What came out was barely a whisper, cracked and wet. He tried again, forcing air through a chest that didn't want to expand. "Sound off now. Who's alive?" For 3 full seconds, nothing answered him but wind screaming through torn fuselage. Then a cough, a groan, a voice shaking young. "Here, I'm here, sir." Another voice older, tighter with pain. "Crew chief's here. My arms, sir, my arm's wrong. It's really wrong." Ryan tried to move, and a bolt of white fire tore up through his left leg, and he understood in the sick, clarifying way the body sometimes understands things faster than the mind can accept them, that the leg was broken. Badly. He could feel bone grinding somewhere it shouldn't be able to grind. "Pilot?" he said, teeth locked against the pain. Somebody check the pilot. Nobody answered that one. A soldier named Douglas crawled toward the front of the wreckage, and when he came back, his face had gone the color of the snow outside. He didn't have to say it. Ryan saw it in the way his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "He's gone, sir." Douglas's voice broke on the word. Sir, he didn't make it." Ryan closed his eyes. Somewhere behind his sternum, something cracked that had nothing to do with the leg. "Okay," he said, because someone had to say something, and rank meant that someone was him. "Okay, everybody breathe. We get a head count, we get eyes on injuries, and then we figure out." "Where's Brooks?" a woman's voice cut in. It was the first time Ryan had heard Specialist Claire Bennett speak since the crash, and something about her tone, steady, controlled, utterly without panic, made 3 heads turn toward her before they turned toward the question itself. "Private Brooks," Claire said again, already moving, already scanning the torn open side of the aircraft where the mountain wind was screaming through a hole that hadn't existed 10 minutes ago. "He was seated right there. He's not there now." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. "He got thrown," Douglas said slowly, horror climbing into his face. "Oh God, he got thrown out." For one terrible moment, nobody moved. 5 broken, bleeding people sat frozen inside the ruined shell of an aircraft while somewhere out in a whiteout blizzard, a sick soldier, a 22-year-old kid who still called his mother every Sunday, was lying in the snow alone, possibly dying, possibly already gone, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. Not yet, not with a broken leg and a shattered arm, and a pilot's body 6 feet away, and a storm outside that could kill a healthy man in 20 minutes. Claire's jaw tightened. That was the only sign she gave that the news had hit her. Then she turned back to Ryan. "Captain, I need to look at that leg. Brooks, Amisham, is somewhere out there in weather that will kill him faster than his injuries will." Claire said, not unkindly, but with a flatness that cut through the rising panic in the cabin like a blade. "And we are in no condition to search for him right now. If I don't stabilize you and the crew chief in the next 10 minutes, you'll both go into shock, and then I'll have 3 people to save instead of 1, and none of us will be in any shape to look for Brooks at all. So, your leg. Now." Ryan stared at her. He had served alongside Claire Bennett for 8 months. He knew her as the medic who kept the aid station spotless, who never raised her voice, who ate lunch alone and answered questions in short, polite sentences, and otherwise seemed to exist at the edges of every room she entered. He had never once heard her speak like this, like someone who had made exactly this kind of decision before more than once, and had made peace with how ugly it felt every single time. "Do it," he said, What happened next would follow every man in that wreckage for the rest of his life, though none of them understood yet what they were watching. Claire moved through the wreckage the way a surgeon moves through an operating room. Economical, unhurried, despite the screaming wind, every motion purposeful. She tore strips from a seat cushion cover. She found a piece of the aircraft's twisted frame and assessed it in seconds as a splint. She talked to Ryan the entire time low and even, not because he needed comfort, but because she needed his leg still, and a man focused on a voice is a man who forgets to flinch. "This is gonna hurt," she said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that. I need you to scream if you need to scream, but I need the leg to stay exactly where I put it. Can you do that?" "Yes," Ryan lied. It hurt more than he had ever imagined pain could hurt. He screamed. He apologized for screaming through gritted teeth. And Claire told him not to be an idiot, that screaming was free and dignity was overrated. And something about the dry matter-of-fact way she said it made him laugh. One broken bark of a laugh in the middle of agony. And that laugh did more to keep him from going into shock than anything else she'd done. Then she moved to their crew chief, a broad-shouldered sergeant named Foster, whose right arm was bent in a way arms were not supposed to bend. "This is bad," Foster said, staring at it like it belonged to someone else. "This is really bad, isn't it?" "It's bad," Claire agreed, because lying to a scared man about the severity of his injury only made things worse later. "It's not going to kill you if we splint it now and keep it clean. It is going to hurt like hell for the next several days, and you're going to hate every single thing about carrying gear one-handed, and you're going to survive it." "Both things are true." Foster let out a shaky laugh that turned into a groan halfway through. "You always this comforting. I'm told it's a gift." It was in its own strange way the first joke anyone had made since the crash, and it did something small but important. In that broken shell of an aircraft, it reminded 5 terrified people that they were still capable of being human. That fear had not yet won. Outside, the storm was getting worse. Douglas, kneeling by the torn opening, called back over his shoulder. "Captain, this thing isn't going to hold. We're exposed on this side. Whole panel's gone." Ryan tried to push himself up and immediately understood he was not going anywhere on his own power. "Options. There's a rock overhang about 40 yards downslope," said the 5th survivor, a quiet 19-year-old private named Alvarez, who had said almost nothing since the crash and whose hands hadn't stopped shaking. "I saw it before we went down. I saw it out the window. If we can get there—" 40 yards in this wind is a lot further than it sounds, Claire said. She was already digging through the wreckage, pulling out anything that could be salvaged: a first aid kit, 2 ration packs, a coil of rope, a flare gun, a signal mirror, a battered handheld radio that sparked and died the moment she touched the power switch. "Radio's gone." "Gone how gone?" Ryan asked, though he already knew from the flat certainty in her voice exactly how gone. "Gone as in it took damage in the crash, and it's not transmitting, and I don't have the parts to fix it out here," Claire said. "We had one shot at getting a distress call out before we hit the ground, and Douglas already sent it. After that, nothing. If anyone's coming, they're coming because of that transmission, not because of anything we do from here." The cabin went quiet again, and in that quiet, 5 people understood the same terrible thing. At the same moment they were alone, injured in a blizzard on a mountain that swallowed search parties, whole with one man missing outside somewhere in weather that killed the healthy, in under an hour, and their only lifeline to the outside world was a single radio transmission that may or may not have gone through before the aircraft hit the trees. "They'll come," Alvarez said, though it sounded less like a statement and more like a prayer. "They have to come. That's the whole point of the unit, right? Nobody gets left." Nobody answered him. Getting Ryan and Foster to the rock overhang took nearly an hour, and it was without exaggeration one of the hardest hours of every person's life in that group. Douglas and Alvarez built a makeshift litter from wreckage and rope. Claire directed the movement with a precision that bordered on cruelty. "Pause here, brace there, don't let his legs swing. Watch that ice patch keep him talking so he doesn't pass out from the pain." And by the time they got both injured, men under the rock overhang, everyone was soaked, frostbitten at the fingertips and shaking uncontrollably. And Mason Brooks was still out there. "We have to look for him," Douglas said, teeth chattering so hard the words came out broken. We can't just leave him." "Nobody's leaving him," Ryan said, though his voice had gone thin with exhaustion and pain. "But nobody goes out in this storm blind. We wait for a break in the weather, and then that was when the radio crackled. It was not their radio. Theirs was dead silent, useless. This was a second unit, a smaller emergency transceiver Claire had pulled from the wreckage, one that ran on a different frequency, one that by pure chance still had enough charge and enough intact circuitry to catch a stray transmission bouncing off the mountains from a base camp 70 miles away. 6 people went utterly still, static, a burst of garbled command chatter, and then cutting through clear as a bell in a way that would haunt every person in that shelter. For years afterward, a voice none of them had expected to hear, so soon cold-clipped, already moving on to the next item on a checklist that no longer included them. Confirmed search assets grounded due to weather presumed loss of the aircraft and crew. All 6 personnel listed KYA pending recovery. Repeat searches suspended. Bring the birds home. Nobody breathed. Foster, half-conscious with pain, opened his eyes. Was that? That was Colonel Whitaker, Ryan said, and his voice had gone somewhere flat and far away, somewhere that didn't sound like him at all. That was Whitaker calling off the search. He thinks we're dead, Alvarez said, and his voice cracked wide open on the last word, 19 years old and suddenly sounding about 12. He thinks we're all ready. He's not even looking for us. He can't do that, Douglas snapped, fury flooding into the fear on his face. That transmission went out right. He has to know. Some of us made it. He has to. He knows nothing, Claire said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her. He knows a helicopter went down in a storm severe enough to ground his rescue assets. He knows the odds of survival in these conditions are low. He's making a command decision with the information he has, and the information he has says we're gone. So that's it. Douglas's voice rose, cracking with something between grief and rage. That's just it. Nobody's coming. We're just supposed to lie here and die because some colonel with a clipboard decided it wasn't worth the risk. No, Claire said, one word. Quiet. Absolute. Ryan looked at her, really looked at her, past the mud and the blood and the exhaustion, and saw something in her face he had never seen there before. Not panic, not despair, something colder and steadier than either, something that looked almost like certainty. They think we're dead, Claire said. Good. That means nobody's counting the days we have left. That means nobody's going to second-guess how we spend them. We don't wait for someone to find us. We move before the mountain decides for us. The words landed in that small stone shelter like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, changing something in the air. Foster, through gritted teeth, managed a broken laugh. You always this comforting, Bennett. I'm told it's a gift, Claire said again, and this time nobody laughed because everyone understood she meant every word of it. The second sentence and the first. Douglas stared at her. You want us to walk out of here. Him with a broken leg. He gestured at Ryan. Him with a shattered arm. Foster, in a blizzard, on a mountain nobody's ever mapped past the ridgeline, with one man still missing somewhere out there in the dark. Yes, Claire said, that's insane. Staying here is insane, Claire said, and for the first time real heat entered her voice. Not anger exactly, but something urgent and unwilling to be argued with. Staying here means we wait for a rescue that has officially been called off. Staying here means we run out of the supplies we salvaged in 3 days, and we're still sitting in the same spot with no plan. When that happens, staying here means Mason Brooks, if he's still alive out there, dies alone because we were too afraid to go look for him. I am not doing that. I am not sitting in this hole waiting to become a statistic in a report nobody's going to read carefully. We move. We find Brooks. And we walk out of these mountains on our own because nobody else is coming to do it for us. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Wind howled past the rock overhang. Somewhere in the trees below, something cracked under the weight of snow, a sound like a gunshot that made everyone flinch. Then Ryan, from where he lay with his legs splinted and throbbing, said the thing that would define the rest of that mission. Do what she says. Douglas turned to him, stunned. Sir, she's the only one of us who hasn't been wrong about a single thing since the crash. Ryan said, and even through the pain fogging his voice, there was command in it, the kind that came from conviction rather than rank. She got my legs splinted before I went into shock. She got Foster stable. She's the one who thought to check the second radio. I don't know where she learned to do half of what she's done in the last 2 hours, and right now I don't care. She's right. We move or we die waiting. I know which one I'm choosing. Nobody argued after that. Not out loud anyway. But Ryan would remember later the way Douglas kept glancing at Claire over the next hour as they prepared to move, not with resentment, not anymore, but with something closer to confusion. The kind of confusion that comes from realizing the person you'd overlooked for 8 months was in fact the only reason any of you were still breathing. They found Mason Brooks 2 hours before nightfall. It was Claire who spotted the disturbed snow at the base of a ridge, nearly 200 yards from the crash site, a drag mark faint under fresh powder, the kind of trace a body leaves when it's thrown clear of wreckage and tumbles downhill under its own momentum. She stopped the group with a single raised hand and pointed without a word. They found him half buried unconscious, one leg bent wrong beneath him, his skin already going the pale blue-white of early hypothermia. For one horrible second, nobody could tell if he was breathing at all. Pulse, Claire said, 2 fingers pressed to his throat, her voice tight with something that wasn't quite panic, but lived right next door to it. He has a pulse. He's alive. Barely, but he's alive. Thank God. Alvarez breathed and it came out half sob. Getting Mason stable in the field in a blizzard with a broken leg, on top of hypothermia, so advanced his lips had gone gray, was not a clean cinematic thing. It was Claire cutting away frozen fabric with hands that had stopped feeling the cold an hour ago. It was Douglas and Alvarez building a windbreak out of packs and branches, while Foster, one-armed and in agony, still insisted on helping, because sitting still and doing nothing felt worse than the pain. It was Claire pressing her own body heat against an unconscious stranger, because she'd read somewhere in some course nobody in that group had ever heard of her, taking that direct skin contact rewarmed a hypothermia victim faster than almost anything else available in the field. Come on, she said to him low, fierce, as though sheer will could keep a heartbeat going. Come on, Brooks. You don't get to check out on us. Not today. Mason's eyes fluttered open, sometime later. Nobody was tracking time anymore. Not really. Not in any way that mattered, and the first thing he saw was Claire's face, 6 inches from his own, furious and relieved in equal measure. You, he croaked, are going to give me a heart attack. You already gave me one, Claire said, and something in her voice cracked just slightly, just for a second before she pulled it back together. Don't do that again. By the time full dark fell, 6 soldiers, 5 walking wounded, and 1 carried between them on a makeshift travois had made it to a shallow cave a half-mile from the crash site, and every single one of them owed his life in some direct and undeniable way to the quiet medic they had spent 8 months walking past without a second glance. Douglas was the one who finally said it out loud, huddled in the dark with the wind screaming outside, and a small, carefully rationed fire throwing orange light across exhausted faces. Where did you learn to do all this? He asked Claire. The splinting, the hypothermia thing, reading tracks in the snow like you were born doing it. That's not Bennett. That's not basic combat medic training. I've been through combat medic training. It's not this. Claire didn't answer right away. She was checking Mason's makeshift splint by firelight. Her expression unreadable. I had some additional training before I joined the unit, she said finally. What kind of additional training? The kind I'm not going to talk about right now, Claire said, not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the subject as firmly as a door. Right now, what matters is getting 5 injured men through about 40 miles of mountain wilderness, with no radio, no rescue coming, and winter closing, and every single day we're out here. Whatever I did before this unit doesn't change any of that. Ryan watched her in the firelight and felt something shift in his understanding of the world. A quiet, seismic recalibration, the kind that happens when you realize the ground you've been standing on isn't what you thought it was. He didn't know yet what quiet mile meant. He didn't know about the classified operations, the recoveries that had happened and never made it into any report the public would ever see, the years of training that had built the woman currently keeping 5 broken men alive on a mountain the Army had already given up on. None of them knew, not yet. All Ryan knew, lying there with his legs splinted and throbbing, and his pilot dead 6 hours behind him, and a colonel 70 miles away, who thought all of them were corpses, was that the quiet medic nobody had ever really seen was the only reason any of them had a tomorrow to walk toward. Outside, the storm howled on, indifferent to all of it. Somewhere in that darkness, 40 miles of frozen wilderness waited between them, and rescue wilderness that had already claimed better prepared, better equipped teams than theirs. And somewhere 70 miles away in a warm command tent with hot coffee and dry boots, Colonel Thomas Whitaker was already drafting the paperwork that would tell 6 families their sons and daughters weren't coming home. He had no idea he was wrong. He had no idea that the woman he had just written off without a second thought, the quiet one, the forgettable one, the one whose file he had probably never even read closely enough to remember her name, was at that exact moment kneeling by a dying fire in a stone cave, checking pulses, rationing food down to the calorie, and quietly, deliberately, without asking permission from anyone, beginning to plan the impossible. Tomorrow, Claire said into the dark when she was sure everyone but Ryan had drifted into exhausted sleep. We start moving toward the river valley. If I'm right about where we are, there's a patrol route about 4 days out. It's not close, it's not easy, but it's the only chance we've got. 4 days, Ryan repeated. His leg was a dull, constant roar of pain even through the makeshift splint. With you carrying half of us. I'm not carrying anyone, Claire said. I'm just going to make sure nobody gets left behind. Ryan studied her for a long moment in the dying firelight, the steady hands, the unreadable calm, the way she never once in the entire nightmare of that day had let fear win a single argument against her. Whitaker's wrong about you, he said quietly. He doesn't even know it yet, but he's wrong. Claire didn't answer that. She just checked, the fire checked, Mason's pulse one more time, and settled in against the cave wall to keep watch through the first of what would become many long freezing nights. 6 soldiers the army had already buried on paper alive against every calculation anyone at command had made, with nothing ahead of them but 40 miles of frozen mountain, a colonel who believed they were already dead, and a quiet woman with a classified past who had just quietly decided without asking anyone's permission that she was going to bring every single one of them home alive. Outside the cave, the wind screamed against the rock like it was furious at being defied. Inside, for the first time since the crash, 6 exhausted people slept not safely, not comfortably, but alive. And for one more night, that was enough. Dawn came without warmth, only a gray, bruised kind of light that filtered through the mouth of the cave. And Claire Bennett was already awake before it arrived, checking pulses one by one down the row of exhausted, shivering men. Like a woman counting something precious she was terrified of losing. Foster. She crouched beside the sergeant, lifted the makeshift splint on his arm, and her face did something small and controlled that Ryan had already learned to read as bad news. How's the pain on a scale you're not going to lie to me about? 8, Foster admitted, teeth chattering. Maybe 9. It's hot, Bennett. It didn't feel hot yesterday. Claire's fingers moved along the skin above the break, and Ryan watched her expression flatten into something carefully blank, the way people go blank when they're hiding fear from everyone but themselves. Infection, she said quietly, only to Ryan, only loud enough for the two of them. Early. If we don't get him somewhere with real medical support in the next few days, it's going to get worse fast. How much worse? Sepsis worse. Claire didn't dress it up. I don't have antibiotics strong enough out here to stop that once it starts moving. Ryan felt the weight of that sentence settle into his chest, like a stone dropped into cold water. 6 people, 1 dead pilot behind them, 1 officer who couldn't walk, 1 man who might lose an arm or his life if the infection outran their pace, 1 19-year-old private who still flinched every time the wind screamed through the rocks, 1 barely conscious kid pulled half-frozen from a snowbank the day before, and a woman nobody had taken seriously 8 months ago, now the only thing standing between all of them and a mountain that had already tried to kill them once. Then we move faster, Ryan said. We move smarter, Claire corrected, already packing the salvage gear into rough, evenly distributed loads. Faster gets people hurt worse than they already are. Smarter gets us there alive. Douglas, hollow-eyed from a night of watching Mason's ragged breathing, looked up from where he sat. There is no smart version of this, Bennett. There's a busted arm, a busted leg, a guy who almost froze to death, a dead radio, and 40 miles of mountain between us and anybody who's still looking for us. Except nobody's looking for us. You heard the same transmission I did. I heard it, Claire said, not rising to the bait in his voice. That doesn't change the math. Whether somebody's looking or not walking is still the only way any of us gets home. So we walk. And if you're wrong about the route, then we adjust, Claire said. But sitting here arguing about it isn't getting us 1 foot closer to anywhere. Get Foster's pack. We're losing daylight. Something in her voice, flat, immovable, utterly without room for negotiation, made Douglas close his mouth. He grabbed the pack. Nobody argued again that morning. By the time they got moving, the sky had turned the color of wet ash and the wind had teeth in it that hadn't been there the day before. Ryan rode a crude litter rigged from tent poles and rope dragged between Douglas and Alvarez, his splinted legs screaming with every jolt over uneven ground. Foster walked under his own power jaw, clenched white, cradling his ruined arm against his chest. Mason drifted in and out, murmuring names that weren't anyone's in the group, and Claire walked beside him for the first hour, one hand resting against his shoulder, murmuring back, steady low anchoring, every time his eyes rolled too far back. 2 hours in the ground narrowed into a shelf of rock, barely wide enough for one person, ice glazing the surface in a sheet that caught the gray light like glass. Single file, Claire called back, testing the surface with her boot before committing her weight to it. Slow, hands on the rock wall, nobody rushes this. Alvarez, second in line, was the one who slipped. It happened fast, a boot skating sideways on black ice. A strangled shout, and then the young private was scrabbling at nothing, one leg already swinging out over a drop that fell away into gray nothing below. Douglas lunged and missed. Foster couldn't move fast enough with one working arm. Grab the wall, Claire's voice cracked across the wind like a gunshot. And somehow, in the half second between falling and gone, Alvarez's hand found a jut of frozen rock and held. He hung there, boots scraping for purchase, breath coming in a high, thin shriek of panic. I've got you. Do not look down. Look at me. Look at my face. Claire was already moving flat against the rock wall, closing the distance in 3 fast, controlled steps that looked nothing like panic. And everything like a woman who had done exactly this kind of thing before, in exactly this kind of terrain, more than once in her life. She got a fist around the back of his jacket, braced her boot against a fracture in the stone, and hauled with a strength that seemed impossible from someone her size. For one endless second, nothing happened. The mountain held its breath. Then Alvarez's knee found the ledge and he scrambled the rest of the way up on his own momentum at chest, heaving face white as the snow around them. I've got you. You're up. You're okay. Claire kept talking low and rapid, both hands gripping his shoulders now, and Ryan watched something pass between the two of them that looked almost like the aftermath of a held breath finally released. Alvarez was shaking too hard to speak for a full minute. When he finally did, his voice came out, cracked open, stripped of every wall. A 19-year-old soldier tries to keep up in front of people he's trying to impress. I thought, he swallowed. I thought that was it. I thought I was going to die on some ledge nobody's ever going to find, and my mom was going to get a letter that just says presumed lost, and that was going to be it. That was going to be my whole life. You're not dying on this ledge, Claire said. And there was something in her voice that wasn't just reassurance, it was a promise, flat and absolute, the kind of thing a person only says when they intend to make it true by force of will, if nothing else. Not today, not on my watch. You hear me? Alvarez nodded, still shaking, and something in his face changed in that moment, the way a person's face changes when they stop seeing someone as background scenery and start seeing them as the reason they're still alive. They pushed on. The ledge widened. The immediate danger passed, but something had shifted in the group, subtle and permanent, the way trust shifts when it's earned in a single terrifying moment instead of built slowly over time. 3 hours later, deep in a stand of frozen pine, Douglas heard it first, a low sound on the wind. Not quite a howl, not quite anything Ryan could place, but every hair on the back of his neck stood up anyway. Tell me that's the wind, Douglas said. Claire had already stopped, one hand raised for silence, her head tilted at an angle that made her look for just a moment like something wild herself. That's not the wind, she said quietly. Wolves. Foster's good hand had already dropped to the sidearm at his hip, the only weapon any of them had salvaged from the wreckage. Maybe something bigger. Doesn't matter which. Claire's voice had dropped into a register none of them had heard from her before, flat, clinical entirely without the warmth she'd shown Alvarez minutes earlier. This was a different Claire Bennett. This was someone who had clearly stood in exactly this kind of danger before and had made exactly these kinds of calculations more times than any quiet medic should ever have needed to. We're wounded, we're slow, and we smell like blood from 3 days of injuries nobody's been able to properly clean. That makes us interesting to whatever's out there. We don't run running makes prey out of us. We move together tight formation and we make ourselves look like something not worth the trouble. How do you know that? Douglas's voice had an edge to it now, something between fear and suspicion. Bennett, how do you know any of this Splint's hypothermia tracking, and now you're giving us a lecture on predator behavior like you've done this 100 times? What exactly did you do before you were handing out bandages in this unit? For a moment, Claire didn't answer. The sound on the wind rose again, closer this time, and whatever conversation might have happened got swallowed by the immediate animal need to move. Later, she said. Right now, formation. Foster weapon up, but don't fire unless I say so. A gunshot out here could bring down more snow than we want falling on our heads. Douglas Alvarez, keep Ryan's litter between us. Move. They moved. The sound followed them at a distance for the better part of an hour, circling never quite close enough to see, close enough to feel. Ryan, flat on his back on the litter, stared up at a gray sky and listened to his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs, and thought with a strange, distant clarity that he had survived a helicopter crash only to possibly become a meal for something with teeth on a mountain nobody would ever find his body on. Then as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Claire didn't relax. Keep moving. It didn't leave because it got bored. Then why'd it stop? Because something else scared it off, Claire said, and something in her tone made Ryan's stomach drop even through the leg pain, which means there's something bigger out here than what was following us. Keep moving, fast as Ryan's leg allows. They pushed hard through the last hour of gray daylight. Nobody speaking, every person's eyes scanning the tree line with a new sharpened kind of fear. By the time true dark fell, they'd covered maybe 6 miles, brutal, bleeding miles that had cost every one of them something, and found a shallow depression in the rock that offered barely enough shelter from the wind to keep a small fire burning through the night. It was there, huddled around that fire, that Mason Brooks' fever spiked. Claire noticed it before anyone else, the way his breathing had gone shallow and fast, the way his skin had turned slick with sweat despite the freezing air, the way his murmurs had turned into something closer to full delirium. Mason, look at me. She had his face between her hands, forcing his glassy eyes to focus on hers. Stay with me. I need you to stay with me. Cold, Mason mumbled. Why is it so cold? I already got warm. I remember getting warm. That was yesterday. You're spiking a fever now, which means your body's fighting something, and I need you to fight with it, not against me. Claire was already digging through the dwindling medical supplies, her hands moving fast, controlled, but Ryan caught the flicker of real fear cross her face before she smoothed it away. Douglas, more water now, as much as we can melt. Alvarez, I need that blanket, the driest one we've got left. Is he going to be okay? Alvarez's voice cracked. He's going to be okay because I'm not giving him another option, Claire snapped, and then catching herself softer. I'm sorry. I need everyone moving right now, not asking me questions I can't answer yet. For the next 2 hours, Claire fought a battle that had no weapons in it except her own 2 hands and a will that refused to bend. She packed snow against Mason's fevered skin to bring his temperature down, then bundled him tight the moment he started shivering too hard, walking that impossible line between overheating and hypothermia with an instinct that looked less like training and more like something burned into her at a level deeper than training could reach. She talked to him the entire time, not medical instructions anymore, but memories, questions, anything to keep his mind tethered to the surface. Tell me about your mom, she said, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. You call her every Sunday, right? Foster mentioned it. Every Sunday? Mason breathed, eyes fluttering. She worries. She always worries. She's gonna get her son back, Claire said, fierce and low. That's what she's going to think, because that's what's going to happen. You're not allowed to prove her wrong. You hear me, Brooks? Not on my watch. Somewhere around the middle of that second night, Mason's fever broke. It happened quietly, almost anticlimactically after 2 hours of terror. His breathing evened out. His skin cooled, and he slipped into something that finally looked like real sleep, instead of the fevered half-consciousness that had gripped him for hours. Claire sat back on her heels, and for one unguarded moment, in the dying light of the fire, Ryan watched her hands shake, really shake, for the first time since the crash, before she pressed them flat against her thighs and forced them still. You okay? Ryan asked quietly. I'm fine. Bennett. She looked at him, and for just a second, the mask slipped enough that he saw something underneath it. Not weakness, but the sheer cost of what she was carrying. The weight of 5 other lives stacked on shoulders that had never once asked to carry them alone. "I've done this before," she admitted so quietly the wind almost stole it. "Not this exact thing, but pulling people through places they weren't supposed to survive. I know how to do it. I don't always know how to feel afterward." "What were you, Bennett, before this unit?" Ryan kept his voice gentle, no demand in it, just genuine wanting to understand the woman who was keeping all of them alive. Because Douglas is right. This isn't standard training. Nobody teaches this in a combat medic course. Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "There's a name," she said finally. "A call sign from before. I'm not supposed to talk about the work that came with it, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't frustrate everyone, and especially right now, when you're all trusting me with your lives and you don't fully know why you should. But I'll tell you this much." She looked up, and the firelight caught something steady and old in her eyes, something that had clearly stared down worse than one mountain. "They used to call me Quiet Mile, because I could get people through places that weren't supposed to have a way through. That's what I did before I was the medic nobody noticed in your unit. And that's what I'm going to do now. Whatever else you need to know can wait until we're off this mountain." Ryan absorbed that in silence. Quiet Mile. It meant nothing to him yet. No context, no history, just 2 words that somehow explained everything and nothing at once. But something about the way she said it, flat and unadorned, without a trace of pride or performance, told him it was true and told him it was bigger than anything she was letting on. "Okay," he said simply. "Quiet Mile, get us home." Far away in a command tent warmed by a generator and lit by electric light that felt like it belonged to a different planet entirely. Colonel Thomas Whitaker was not sleeping either. He sat at a folding table with 6 personnel files open in front of him. The beginning drafts of notification letters half written in a hand that had started out steady and had gotten progressively less so with each one. He'd written condolence letters before. He'd never gotten used to it, and some small, stubborn part of him was grateful for that. A commander who got used to writing those letters was a commander who'd lost something important. A young captain named Reyes knocked on the tent pole, waited for acknowledgement, and stepped inside with a look on her face that Whitaker had learned over 11 months serving under him to recognize as trouble. "Sir, I want to formally register an objection to suspending the search." Whitaker didn't look up from the letter in front of him. "Noted. Objection logged. Anything else, Captain?" "Sir, with respect, that transmission we caught before the radio went dark, it wasn't garbled. Comms confirmed at least one voice came through clean before the signal cut. That means somebody survived the crash long enough to key a mic. That's not nothing." "That's exactly what a dying transmission sounds like, Captain. A last burst of signal before the equipment fails completely. It doesn't mean there's a survivor standing next to a working radio waiting for us to come find them. It means there was for a few seconds before the storm and the terrain finished what the crash started. Or it means 6 of our people are alive down there, right now watching that storm waiting for us, and we've already told command they're dead." Reyes's voice had gone tight, controlled anger just barely leashed. "Sir Specialist Bennett was on that manifest. I don't know if you remember her, but I do. She treated my sprained ankle during winter exercises last year. Didn't say 10 words the whole time, just fixed it and moved on to the next soldier who needed her. People like that don't get remembered enough while they're here, sir. The least we can do is not give up on her the second she's not standing in front of us." Whitaker set his pen down, slow and deliberate, and looked up at his captain with an expression that was harder to read than she probably expected. "You think I made this call lightly, Captain? I think you made it fast, sir. Those aren't always the same thing. I have 3 aircraft. 2 are grounded for maintenance that can't be rushed without risking the crews flying them. The 3rd flew the last search pattern before the storm made visibility 0, and the pilot told me straight to my face that another pass in these conditions was a coin flip on losing that aircraft too. You want me to risk a 7th, 8th, 9th life chasing a signal that might have been nothing but dying static? Tell me where that line is, Captain, because I genuinely like to know. Tell me exactly how many more people I'm allowed to gamble before it's the wrong call instead of the hard one." Reyes didn't have an answer for that, not immediately, and the silence between them stretched long enough that the wind outside the tent seemed to fill it on purpose. "I don't know where that line is either, sir," she said, finally quieter now. "But I know I'd rather be wrong for trying too hard than wrong for not trying hard enough. And I think somewhere down deep you know that too. Or you wouldn't still be sitting here at 0200 rewriting the same letter for the fourth time instead of sleeping. She left without waiting for a response. Whitaker sat alone with 6 files, 6 half-written letters, and a silence that had teeth in it. He picked the pen back up. He did not this time manage to write a single new word. Back on the mountain, dawn broke on the third day with a sky the color of a fresh bruise, and Claire had everyone moving before the light had fully committed to arriving. "We push hard today," she said, checking Foster's arm, worse red streaks now crawling up from the break in a pattern that made her jaw tighten in a way she didn't bother hiding anymore. "I want to hit the river valley by tonight. Once we're in the valley, the terrain evens out, and we can move faster, even hurt. Staying up here costs us time we don't have." "And if the river's running high?" Douglas asked. Something in his voice had changed since the ledge, since watching her catch Alvarez, since 2 nights of watching her fight for lives that weren't asking to be saved and win anyway. The suspicion was gone. What replaced it sounded almost like faith, cautious and newly built, but real. "Then we find a way across it," Claire said. "We found a way through everything else this mountain's thrown at us so far." They moved through that day in a kind of grim, wordless rhythm. Pain managed by silence, fear managed by forward motion. 5 broken people and 1 man carrying a name he hadn't fully explained yet, all of them walking on the shared unspoken understanding that stopping was the only truly fatal option left to them. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin, and somewhere below them, muffled by distance and the last of the day's wind, came a sound none of them had heard in 3 days. Moving water. Alvarez was the first to break into something like a smile, small, exhausted, but real. "That's the river. That's got to be the river she was talking about." "Don't celebrate yet," Claire said, though even her voice carried something lighter than it had in hours. "A river this time of year fed by snowmelt and storm runoff, that's not good news by itself. That's just the next problem introducing itself." They crested a final ridge as the light began its slow collapse into evening, and below them, cutting through the valley floor like a wound that refused to close, the river came into view, wide, fast-churning white, in places where it shouldn't have been running at all, this deep into winter, swollen far beyond what any of them had hoped for. Foster, cradling his infected arm, stared down at it with an expression that had gone somewhere past exhaustion into something closer to disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. "After everything, after the ledge, after the thing in the woods, after Brooks damn near dying twice now, we've got to figure out how to get 5 wounded people across that." Claire stood at the edge of the ridge, silent for a long moment, studying the water with the same flat, calculating focus she'd shown at the ice ledge at the wolf sounds in the trees at every crisis this mountain had thrown at them so far. "We will," she said finally, quiet but absolute, the same tone she'd used the very first night in the wreckage when Douglas had asked if this was insane. "We didn't come this far to stop at a river." Behind her, 6 exhausted people stood on the edge of a ridge, with darkness falling fast, a raging river below them, an infected wound spreading through one man's arm, a colonel 70 miles away who had already told their families they weren't coming home, and nothing ahead of them but a crossing that looked in the failing light, very much like it might be the thing that finally broke what 4 days of frozen mountain hadn't managed to break. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The river roared on beneath them, indifferent, patient, exactly the kind of obstacle that didn't care how far they had already come or how much they had already survived to get there. The river valley didn't get less terrifying the longer they stared at it, and Claire Bennett knew that better than anyone standing on that ridge, which was exactly why she didn't let anyone stand there staring at it for long. "Nobody's crossing tonight," she said, already turning her back on the water and scanning the tree line for cover. "Not in this light, not with this current. We find shelter, we rest what we can, and we cross at first light when we can actually see what we're dealing with." "Foster can't wait much longer," Douglas said quietly, glancing at the sergeant whose face had gone pale and slick with sweat, despite the cold, the red streaks climbing higher up his forearm with every hour that passed. "Look at him, Bennett. That's not something that gets better with rest." "I know exactly what that is," Claire said, and something sharp cut through her voice for the first time in hours. "I'm the one who's been checking it every 2 hours since yesterday morning. I know the clock we're on, but crossing that river in the dark doesn't save Foster's arm. It drowns all of us, and then nobody's arm gets saved because nobody makes it out at all. We wait for light." Nobody argued. Nobody had the strength left to argue honestly, and something in Claire's flat, unshakable certainty had stopped inviting argument days ago anyway. They found a hollow beneath a fallen tree, half collapsed but enough to break the wind, and built the smallest fire the dwindling wood supply would allow. Claire redressed Foster's arm by firelight, her jaw tight the entire time, saying nothing about what she saw beneath the bandage, which told Ryan everything he needed to know about how bad it had gotten. "Just say it," Foster said, watching her face instead of his own arm. "Whatever you're not saying, say it." Claire met his eyes. "The infection's ahead of what I can treat out here. If we don't get you real antibiotics in the next 2 days, I'm looking at losing the arm to save the rest of you. Maybe sooner than 2 days." Foster absorbed that with a slow nod, and then because the alternative was letting the fear win, he managed a broken half-smile. "Guess I'm motivated to swim fast tomorrow then." "Guess you are," Claire said, and something about the exchange, brutal honesty wrapped in gallows humor, had become the language this group spoke fluently now, 4 days into a nightmare none of them had trained for. Mason, propped against the fallen log with color finally returned to his face, watched the exchange with quiet, exhausted gratitude. "You know," he said, voice still rough from 2 days of fever, "back at base, half the guys used to joke you were a ghost. Bennett's there, Bennett's not there. Nobody ever really notices either way." He shook his head slowly. "I don't think anybody's going to make that joke again." Claire didn't answer that directly. She just checked his pulse one more time, adjusted his blanket, and moved on to Alvarez, who'd said almost nothing since the near fall on the ice ledge, his eyes carrying a kind of hollow 1,000-yard exhaustion that worried Ryan more than he let on. "You good?" Claire asked him quietly, crouching beside him. Alvarez nodded too fast, the nod of someone who wasn't good at all. "Just tired." "You almost died yesterday," Claire said gently. "It's allowed to still be sitting with you. You don't have to pretend it isn't." Alvarez's jaw worked for a second before the words came out small and cracked. "I keep feeling my hands slipping. Even now. Even sitting still, I keep feeling it." "That's your body remembering something it's not ready to let go of yet," Claire said. "It'll fade. It doesn't fade because you ignore it. Fades because you keep moving anyway, one day at a time, until the memory stops being louder than everything that came after it." She paused. "I promise you, Alvarez, I've had memories like that. They fade." It was the closest she'd come in 4 days to admitting out loud just how much of her own past lived behind the calm, unshakable exterior she wore like armor, and Ryan, watching from across the small fire, filed it away, with all the other pieces of Claire Bennett that didn't add up to a quiet, forgettable medic, pieces that were starting to add up to something else entirely. 70 miles away in a command tent lit by a humming generator, Captain Reyes hadn't slept either. She'd spent the hours since her confrontation with Colonel Whitaker doing something she technically hadn't been ordered to do, and technically hadn't been ordered not to do, pulling every scrap of satellite and thermal imagery available from the hours after the crash, running it against known terrain, looking for anything, any flicker of movement, any anomaly that a storm-blind search pattern might have missed. At 0340, she found it. A thermal bloom, faint, intermittent, consistent with a small group, moving on foot through dense tree cover, exactly the kind of signature 6 survivors dragging wounded through wilderness would produce, exactly the kind of signature that had been sitting unremarked in archived satellite data for 2 full days because nobody had thought to look for it after the search was called off. Reyes didn't wait for morning. She didn't wait for protocol. She walked straight into Whitaker's tent at 3:45 in the morning, with a tablet in her hand and something fierce and furious burning behind her eyes. "Sir, I need 5 minutes and then you can throw me out of this tent if you still think I'm wasting your time." Whitaker, hollow-eyed from a night that clearly hadn't included sleep, looked up from a letter he still hadn't finished. "Captain, it's thermal imagery from 2 days ago." Reyes set the tablet down in front of him without waiting for permission, her hand not quite steady. A cluster moving consistent with a small group on foot tracking roughly southeast from the crash coordinates. "It's faint. It's intermittent, but it's there, sir, and it wasn't there before the crash, and it's moving in a pattern that machinery and wildlife don't move in." Whitaker stared at the screen for a long moment, and something in his face, the careful, controlled composure of a man who had spent 2 days making peace with a decision, began slowly to crack. "This could be anything," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. Elk, a ranger patrol we don't have on record. Interference. It could be, Riaz agreed, or it could be 6 of our people walking out of that mountain on their own because we told them nobody was coming. She let that sit in the tent between them, heavy and undeniable. Sir, I'm not asking you to launch a full search in weather we can't fly in. I'm asking you to let me flag this, keep monitoring it, and have assets ready to move the second the weather breaks. That's it. That's all I'm asking. Whitaker looked at the thermal bloom on the screen for a long, long moment. Then he looked at the 6 half-finished condolence letters still spread across his table, each one a monument to a decision he had made in under a minute and had been unable to stop revisiting ever since. Keep monitoring it, he said, finally quiet. Hourly updates. The second that storm breaks even a little, I want assets ready to move on my order. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It wasn't an apology. But it was, Reyes understood as she left the tent, the first crack in a decision Colonel Thomas Whitaker had believed 24 hours ago was already closed. Dawn broke gray and merciless over the river valley, and Claire Bennett was on her feet before the light had fully arrived, already walking the bank upstream, scanning the water with the same flat-focused intensity she'd shown at every obstacle this mountain had thrown at them. Where's she going? Alvarez asked, voice thick with sleep and cold. Finding us a way across, Ryan said, watching her figure move along the bank, small and steady against the roar of the current. That's what she does. Claire was gone almost 40 minutes, and by the time she returned, the tension in the group had wound tight enough that Douglas had actually started pacing bad leg, or no bad leg, muttering about search parties and rivers and mountains that didn't care how much a person had already survived. There, Claire pointed upstream, breathless from the walk, her boots soaked to the ankle from testing the bank's edge in a dozen places. About 400 yards up the river, splits around a gravel bar. Current's still fast, but it's shallower there, chest height on me, instead of over my head, and the gravel bar gives us a rest point halfway across instead of one long crossing. You waded into that current to check? Foster asked, incredulous. Only up to my knees. I'm not suicidal, Foster. I'm thorough. A ghost of a smile crossed her face, the first real one in what felt like a lifetime. Come on, daylight's not going to wait for us to feel ready. The walk to the gravel bar took 20 minutes that felt like 20 years. Every step of fresh negotiation with pain and exhaustion for 4 of the 6 people making it. When they finally stood at the water's edge, the current looked no less terrifying up close than it had from the ridge, fast cold enough to stop a heart loud enough to swallow conversation. Order of operations, Claire said, raising her voice over the water. I go first, rope secured on this bank to confirm the crossing and anchor the line on the far side. Then Alvarez, because you're strongest on your feet right now, and I want a second set of hands on that far bank helping pull people in. Then Ryan on the litter, Douglas and Foster. You're going to need to help float that, not carry it. The current does some of the work if we let it. Then Foster, then Mason, then Douglas last, and I'll be back across to help him if he needs it. You've done this before, Douglas said. It wasn't a question anymore. It hadn't been a question in 2 days. I've done this before, Claire confirmed, tying the rope around her waist with quick practiced hands. Watch how I move. Copy it exactly. The current wants to take your legs out from under you. You fight that by staying low, moving at an angle instead of straight across, and never ever letting the water get above your center of gravity if you can help it. She went in without further ceremony, and Ryan's stomach dropped watching her, small and alone, disappear step by step into water the color of gunmetal. The current dragging visibly at her legs even as she fought it with the steady angled steps she just described. Twice she staggered. Twice she caught herself and kept moving and didn't look back to see the 6 pairs of eyes locked on her with their hearts in their throats. When she finally hauled herself up onto the gravel bar on the far side, soaked through and shaking with cold, a ragged cheer went up from the bank behind her, the first sound like joy any of them had made in 4 days. Your turn, she shouted back, voice barely carrying over the roar. Alvarez angle upstream, lean into it, don't fight it, straight on. Alvarez went in white-faced but steady and made it across in a crossing that looked by comparison to Claire's almost easy, the rope already anchored, the path already proven, a hand waiting on the far side to pull him the last few feet. Then came Ryan. Getting a man with a broken leg across a swollen river on a makeshift litter was without question the single most terrifying 20 minutes of Ryan Caldwell's life, worse even than the crash itself because the crash had happened too fast to be afraid during. This was slow. This was the current tugging at the litter, with a strength that felt personal, felt hungry, while Douglas and Foster fought to keep it above water, with one working arm between the two of them doing most of the work, and Claire and Alvarez hauled the guide rope from the far side with everything they had left. Halfway across, the litter dipped with water sloshing over Ryan's chest cold enough to steal the air from his lungs entirely, and for one horrifying second he was certain that this was how it ended. Not in a helicopter crash, not on a mountain, but drowned 20 feet from a riverbank after surviving everything else this nightmare had thrown at him. Pull, Claire's voice cut through the water's roar like a blade. Pull now, pull hard, don't stop pulling. The litter lurched forward, dragged the last few feet through water that fought every inch, and then hands were everywhere hauling, grabbing, and Ryan was on the gravel bar coughing up river water. Alive, shaking alive. "You're okay." Claire's face swam into view above him, soaked and fierce and relieved all at once. "You're okay, Ryan. You're across. You're okay." "Remind me," Ryan managed between coughs, "to never complain about a helicopter again." Foster went next, one-armed, teeth gritted, against pain that the cold water only sharpened, and made it across with Douglas, half carrying him the last stretch when his strength gave out completely. Mason, still weak from the fever, crossed, clinging to Claire's shoulder, her arm locked around him the entire way, refusing to let the current so much as touch him without a fight. That left Douglas. He went in alone, the last one, the rope, his only lifeline, and it was 3/4 of the way across, close enough that everyone had already started to relax, already started to believe the worst was over, that his foot caught on something beneath the surface and the current sensing weakness, the way rivers always seemed to took him. "Douglas!" Claire was moving before the shout had fully left her mouth, wading back into water she just fought her way out of, ignoring every scream of exhausted muscle and freezing nerve, because a man was drowning 20 feet away, and there was no version of Claire Bennett that stood on a riverbank and watched that happen. She caught him by the collar just as the current tried to sweep him past the gravel bar entirely, and for a moment the two of them were simply a tangle of limbs and desperate grips in water that didn't care about either of their lives, until Alvarez and Foster reached the edge and hauled them both in by main force, all four of them collapsing in a heap on the gravel, gasping, soaked alive. Douglas lay on his back, chest heaving, staring up at a gray sky that had almost claimed him. And when he finally found his voice, it came out cracked, wide open. "You went back in," he said, staring at Claire. "You'd already made it across. You were done, and you went back in for me." "That's not a question," Claire said, still catching her breath. "So I'm not sure what you want me to say. I spent the first 2 days of this thinking you were some quiet nobody who got lucky with a few field skills." Douglas pushed himself up onto his elbows, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face that hadn't been there before, something that looked a great deal like shame mixed with something closer to awe. "I was wrong. I've been wrong about you since before we even got on that helicopter, probably. I'm sorry, Bennett, for all of it." Claire was quiet for a moment, water still dripping from her hair, and when she answered, her voice had none of its usual clinical flatness, just something tired and human and quietly moved. "Apology accepted," she said. "Now let's get off this riverbank before we all freeze to death, celebrating that we didn't drown." They found a rock overhang a half-mile from the crossing, and Claire built a fire big enough for the first time in days to actually dry their soaked clothes and gear, judging the risk of a larger flame worth it against the near certainty of hypothermia if they stayed wet through another freezing night. 6 shivering, exhausted people huddled close, and for the first time since the crash, something like real hope crept into the circle of firelight. It was Mason, watching the flames, who finally asked the question that had been sitting unspoken since the first night. "Quiet Mile," he said. "That's what you told Ryan, right? That's what they called you." Claire looked up, surprised, he knew, then glanced at Ryan, who shrugged. Not an apology exactly, just an acknowledgement that secrets didn't survive well in a group that had nearly drowned together twice in one morning. "That's right," Claire said. "What's it mean?" Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when she spoke, her voice had gone somewhere distant, somewhere that clearly cost her something to visit. "It means I used to do this," she said. "Not exactly this, every mission's different, but this, getting people out of places they weren't supposed to survive. I was part of a program most people never hear about, doing recoveries that never made it into any report the public would ever see. I did that for 4 years before I asked for a transfer to a regular unit. She paused. I asked for the transfer because I got tired of being the last thing standing between someone and a body bag. I thought a quiet post-checking equipment, handing out bandages for sprained ankles, I thought that might let me breathe for a while. And instead, you got us, Alvarez said quietly. And instead, I got you, Claire agreed, something almost like a smile ghosting across her exhausted face. Funny how that works. Why didn't you ever say anything? Foster asked. 8 months, Bennett. 8 months of watching you organize supply closets and nobody had any idea. Because the people I used to work with taught me something, Claire said. The ones who talk about what they can do are usually worth less than the ones who don't. I didn't need anybody to know. I just needed to be ready in case I was ever needed again. She looked around the fire at 5 faces watching her with an entirely new kind of attention than they had ever paid her before. I suppose I got my wish. The moment held warm despite the cold until Ryan, watching Claire's face carefully in the firelight, asked the question that had been sitting at the edge of his mind since the second night. Whitaker, he said, does he know about Quiet Mile? About what you actually are? Claire's expression flickered, something complicated crossing it before she smoothed it away. I don't know what's in my file that he's bothered to read. Probably nothing. People like Whitaker don't read personnel files closely unless there's a reason to. A pause. He's about to have a reason. It was Douglas, on watch an hour later, while the others slept in the fire's dying warmth, who spotted the movement in the tree line below. Bennett, his whisper was tight, urgent, cutting through the low crackle of the fire. Bennett, wake up, now. Claire was awake and alert in half a second, the kind of instant, complete wakefulness that comes only from years of training the body to answer danger before the mind fully catches up. What is it? Movement? Down in the trees, maybe 200 yards out? I count. Douglas squinted into the gray pre-dawn light. I count at least 4, maybe by moving in a line. That's not wildlife, Bennett. That's people. Claire's blood went cold in a way the river hadn't managed. She crawled to the edge of the overhang, following Douglas's line of sight, and after a long, tense moment, she saw them too, figures moving through the trees with the deliberate, coordinated spacing of people who knew exactly what they were doing, carrying long shapes across their backs that were unmistakably weapons. Get everyone up, she breathed. Quiet, no noise, no fire, nobody stands up fast, now. The next 90 seconds were some of the tensest of the entire ordeal. 5 exhausted, injured people forced awake and into absolute silence in the space of a breath, Claire moving among them with quick, urgent hand signals, smothering the fire's last embers with snow before the smoke could give away their position. Everyone pressed flat against the rock, hearts hammering as the line of armed figures moved through the valley below. Who are they? Alvarez mouthed, barely a whisper, terror plain on his face. Claire shook her head slightly. I don't know, and it doesn't matter, and pressed a finger to her lips. For 3 full minutes that felt like 3 hours, 6 people lay motionless against frozen rock, while unknown armed strangers moved through the valley 200 yards below, close enough that if any one of them had coughed, had shifted wrong, had let so much as a boot scrape against stone, the entire outcome of 4 brutal days might have come apart in an instant. Mason, still weak, still fighting the last edges of his fever, began to shiver hard enough that his teeth threatened to chatter audibly, and Claire pressed her own body against his without a word, absorbing the sound-sharing warmth, holding him still through sheer physical contact until the shivering settled into something silent. The figures below paused, once seeming to study something on the ground, a footprint maybe, or a disturbed patch of snow from the group's passage the day before, and Ryan felt his heart stop entirely, certain the search was over, certain this was it. Certain 4 days of impossible survival was about to end, not with rescue, but with something far worse. Then after a moment that stretched into an eternity, the figures moved on, disappearing into the tree line to the west, and the valley went quiet again, except for the distant roar of the river they'd crossed hours before. Nobody moved for a full 5 minutes after that. When Claire finally exhaled and sat back against the rock, and her hands were shaking for the second time in 24 hours. Who were they? Douglas whispered again once it felt safe enough to speak. I don't know, Claire admitted. Could be poachers working this land illegally. Could be something else entirely this far off any marked trail and country. This remote people who move in an organized line, carrying weapons like that aren't out here for a hiking trip. Whatever they were, we do not want to find out by getting closer." She looked around at 5 pale, terrified faces. "We wait another hour, we make sure they're well clear, and then we move. Different direction than we planned, further east, longer route, but further from wherever they came from." "Longer route means longer out here," Foster said, and everyone heard what he didn't say. Longer out here meant more time for the infection, climbing his arm to win a race. Claire had already told him quietly she wasn't sure she could keep him ahead of. "I know," Claire said, and the weight of that admission sat heavy in the cold morning air. "I know exactly what it means, Foster. I'm choosing it anyway because the alternative is walking straight into whatever that was, and I'm not willing to bet 6 lives on finding out what it is." Nobody argued. Nobody had it in them to argue anymore. Not after the river, not after the ledge, not after 4 days of a woman none of them had truly known, making one impossible call after another and being right every single time it mattered most. They moved east an hour later, exhausted, soaked clothes only half dry from the truncated fire. Every one of them carrying a new, sharper fear now, on top of all the old ones. But something had solidified in the group by then, something that hadn't existed on the first night in the wreckage. A trust in Claire Bennett that had stopped being conditional and become something closer to unshakable faith. They pushed through that 4th day harder than any day before it, driven by the ticking clock in Foster's arm and the knowledge that whoever had been moving through that valley might still be somewhere ahead of them, might still cross their path again with far less warning next time. It was mid-afternoon, the light already beginning its early winter collapse toward evening, when Claire stopped the group with a raised hand and a look on her face that made everyone's stomach drop in unison. "What?" Ryan asked from the litter, voice tight. Claire was crouched, studying the ground. Not tracks this time, not danger, but something that made her expression shift into something Ryan hadn't seen on her since the crash itself. "Boot prints," she said slowly. "Fresh, military tread pattern, not the same as whatever we saw this morning." She looked up and something that might have been hope, carefully guarded, flickered across her face for the first time in 4 days. "This is a patrol route. We're closer than I thought. Maybe half a day if these tracks are as recent as they look." The words landed on the group like sunlight breaking through storm clouds after 4 days of nothing but gray. Alvarez let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Douglas closed his eyes and exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding since the crash. Even Foster, gray-faced and fighting infection with everything he had left, managed to smile. "Half a day," Mason repeated, disbelieving. "We might actually make it." "We might," Claire said, careful, unwilling to promise something the mountain hadn't confirmed yet. "But half a day out here is still half a day. We don't get careless because we're close. Careless is how people die 20 feet from the finish line. Understood?" "Understood," Ryan said, and meant it even as something in his chest had already begun. Cautiously to believe that after everything, the crash, the ledge, the river, the armed strangers in the valley, they might actually impossibly be about to survive this. They pushed on into the fading light, following the fresh boot prints east, every person in that battered, exhausted group carrying the same fragile, dangerous thing they hadn't dared to carry in 4 days. Hope. And somewhere ahead of them, unknown to any of the 6 survivors trudging through failing light toward a patrol route they prayed was real, a young soldier stood post at a checkpoint that hadn't seen anything unusual in weeks, stamping his feet against the cold, entirely unprepared for what was about to walk out of the tree line and change the rest of his career and the rest of Colonel Thomas Whitaker's forever. Night fell hard and fast on the 4th day, and with it came the moment Claire Bennett had been dreading since she first pressed her fingers against Foster's swollen arm 2 days earlier. "Bennett?" Foster's voice had gone strange, thick, slurred at the edges, nothing like the dry, steady sergeant who'd been cracking jokes through broken bones since the crash. "Bennett, I don't feel so good." Claire was at his side before the sentence finished, hands already moving, checking his forehead, his pulse, the color climbing up past his elbow toward his shoulder, in an angry red that hadn't been there that morning. "Talk to me," she said, keeping her voice level even as her stomach dropped. "Tell me your name, your unit, where you're from." "Foster, Staff Sergeant Foster." He blinked slowly, like the words were swimming away from him before he could catch them. I'm from, he stopped. His eyes went unfocused, drifting somewhere past Claire's shoulder. "Why is it so bright in here? Somebody get the lights." There were no lights. There was only the last gray edge of dusk and a fire Claire hadn't dared build any bigger than a whisper of flame. "He's septic," she said, and for the first time in 4 days, her voice cracked wide open with something that sounded unmistakably like fear. "It's in his blood now. This isn't the arm anymore. This is his whole system." "What does that mean?" Alvarez's voice came out high and thin, panic climbing fast. "It means his organs start shutting down if I can't get his fever under control and get fluids into him faster than the infection can spread." Claire was already tearing open the last of the medical supplies, hands moving with a speed that had abandoned all pretense of calm. "Douglas, I need every scrap of clean snow we can melt right now." "Ryan, talk to him. Keep him answering questions. Don't let him drift." "Foster." Ryan dragged himself half upright on the litter, gritting his teeth against the fire in his own leg, and grabbed the sergeant's good hand. "Foster, look at me. Tell me about your kid. You've got a kid, right? Tell me about her." "Emma," Foster mumbled, eyes fluttering, fighting to focus on Ryan's face. She's 6. She's got my wife's eyes, thank God, not mine. Terrible eyes, mine. Can't see a menu without—" His words slurred into nothing, his head lolling. "Foster," Claire's voice cracked like a whip. "Stay with him, Ryan. Don't let him go quiet." For the next 2 hours in failing light, in a cold that seemed determined to finish what the crash had started, Claire Bennett fought a battle with no clean lines and no guarantee of winning. She packed what little clean snow they could gather against Foster's burning skin. She forced sips of water past his cracked lips every few minutes, always checking the fluttering, unreliable pulse at his wrist. She talked to him low and relentless, refusing to let the silence win, even when Foster himself seemed to be drifting somewhere she couldn't follow. "You don't get to do this," she told him, fierce and quiet, gripping his good hand so tight her knuckles had gone white. "You don't get to make it through a helicopter crash, in a mountain and a river just to lose to an infection 12 hours from a checkpoint. Emma needs her dad to tell her this story someday. Stay with me, Foster. Stay with me." Somewhere past midnight, Foster's fever broke, not fully, not safely, but enough. His breathing evened. His eyes, when they opened again, found Claire's face with something closer to real recognition instead of the glassy drift of the hours before. "Did I miss anything good?" he rasped. Claire let out a breath that shook on its way out, something between a laugh and a sob that she swallowed before it could fully escape. "You missed me almost losing about 10 years off my life. Don't do that again." "No promises." Foster managed, and even that thin, exhausted joke felt in that moment like the sweetest sound any of them had heard in 4 days. But Claire didn't sleep after that. She sat beside him through what remained of the night, checking his pulse every 20 minutes by feel alone, because she understood better than anyone else in that group, from a past none of them fully knew yet, that a fever breaking once didn't mean a body had won the war. It only meant it had survived one more battle in it. Dawn arrived thin and pale, and Claire had them moving again within the hour, faster than caution probably allowed, because caution was a luxury measured against a clock now ticking louder than it ever had. "How far?" Douglas asked, half carrying Foster's good side, the sergeant's strength visibly diminished from the crisis of the night before. "If those tracks yesterday were what I think they were," Claire said, scanning the terrain ahead with an intensity that hadn't wavered once in 4 days, "we should hit the patrol route before midday." "Should," Mason repeated, weak, but managing to walk now under his own power for the first time since the crash, leaning on a branch Douglas had cut for him. "You've said should about a lot of things this week, Bennett." "And I've been right about a lot of things this week," Claire shot back, and the exhausted, battered group actually managed something close to a laugh. Small, worn thin, but real. The kind of laugh that only happens between people who have survived something together and know it. They pushed through the morning in a rhythm that had become second nature by now. Pain endured in silence, fear folded into forward motion, 6 people who had entered that wilderness as strangers to each other in every way that mattered and were emerging from it as something closer to family. It was Alvarez, scouting a few yards ahead at Claire's direction, who saw it first. "Bennett!" His voice cracked with disbelief, then rose into something closer to a shout. "Bennett, I see a road. I see an actual road." Everyone froze. Then everyone moved at once, exhaustion, forgotten, adrenaline, flooding through 6 bodies that had been running on fumes for what felt like a lifetime. Claire reached Alvarez's position first and stared down at what he'd found, a gravel access road, clearly maintained tire tracks pressed fresh into mud that hadn't fully frozen overnight. "That's a supply route," she breathed. And for the first time in 4 days, something in her carefully controlled composure genuinely broke, not into panic, but into something raw and disbelieving and almost too big to hold. "That's an active supply route. Somebody drove this within the last day." "Which means a checkpoint," Ryan said from the litter, voice tight with hope he was almost afraid to let himself feel. "Which means people. Actual people, Bennett. Which means we're not done yet," Claire said, forcing her voice back into the flat, controlled cadence that had kept all of them alive for 4 brutal days, even as her eyes stayed locked on that muddy road like it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "We follow it. We stay alert. We do not get careless now, not when we're this close." They followed the road for nearly 2 hours, hope climbing with every set of tire tracks, every discarded ration wrapper, every small sign that friendly human beings, hopefully had passed this way recently. Foster's strength was failing again by the time the road curved around a stand of trees and opened into a clearing, and Douglas was practically carrying him. At that point, the sergeant's feet barely finding purchase on the ground beneath him. "There," Claire said, and her voice cracked on the single word in a way it hadn't cracked once through 4 days of ice ledges and rivers and armed strangers in the tree line. "There, that's it. That's the checkpoint." A young soldier named Private First Class Danny Okafor had drawn checkpoint duty that morning for what he'd assumed, grumbling to himself over cold coffee, would be another entirely uneventful shift on an entirely unremarkable stretch of supply road. He'd been at that post for 6 months. Nothing had ever happened. Nothing was supposed to happen. It was, by every account he'd give afterward for the rest of his career, the most boring assignment in the entire operation. He was leaning against the checkpoint barrier, stamping his feet against the morning cold, half watching the tree line out of habit more than expectation, when movement caught his eye that made his entire body go rigid with a jolt of pure adrenaline. Figures, coming out of the trees, 6 of them. His first thought, trained into him by 6 months of routine, was that it had to be a patrol. He hadn't been briefed on some unit rotation nobody had bothered to flag on his sheet. His second thought, arriving half a second later, the figures came fully into view, was that nothing about what he was looking at matched any patrol he'd ever seen. One man was being dragged on a litter, his legs splinted in a way that screamed field improvisation, not proper medical equipment. Another walked bent nearly double, one arm cradled against his chest, his face gray with a sickness Okafor could see even from a distance. A third stumbled forward, on legs that clearly didn't want to hold him anymore, leaning heavily on a soldier half carrying him. And leading them, Okafor would say later, like she'd been doing it her whole life, was a woman soaked and filthy and clearly exhausted, past any reasonable limit of human endurance, who nonetheless walked with a straight back and a steady, unwavering pace that carried an authority Okafor had rarely seen from officers twice her apparent rank. "Hey!" Okafor's voice cracked with disbelief as he fumbled for his radio, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "Hey, I need somebody get down here. I need eyes on this right now." Claire raised a hand as they approached, palm out, slow and deliberate, the universal signal of someone who understood exactly how alarming 6 half-dead soldiers emerging from unmarked wilderness must look to a checkpoint that had gone 6 months without incident. "Specialist Claire Bennett," she called out, her voice hoarse but carrying clear across the clearing. "Survivors of the helicopter crash in the Raven Creek Mountains 4 days ago. We need medical evacuation immediately for the men behind me. Staff Sergeant Foster has a systemic infection that needs treatment right now, not in an hour." Okafor stared at her radio, still clutched in a shaking hand, and for a solid 3 seconds his brain simply refused to process the sentence he'd just heard. He swallowed hard. "The Raven Creek crash. That search got called off days ago. Everybody on that manifest is listed as KIA," Claire finished for him, flat exhausted with 4 days of hard-won weight behind the word. "I know, we heard the transmission ourselves over a backup radio about 6 hours after we heard the search got suspended. And then we walked out anyway. So if it's all the same to you, Private, I'd appreciate you getting that radio call in before Sergeant Foster's infection gets any worse. Because right now, that's the only thing standing between him and losing an arm, or worse." Okafor's hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to key the radio properly. When his voice finally came through, it came through cracked, wide open with a mixture of disbelief and urgency that would echo across every radio channel at base within minutes. Command, this is Checkpoint 7. I need immediate medical evacuation. He stopped staring again at the six figures now stumbling into the clearing around him, at the litter, at the ragged bandages, at the sheer impossible fact of them. I have survivors. I have 6 survivors from the Raven Creek crash. They're alive. Their command, do you copy? They're alive, and they walked out. 70 miles away in a command tent that had over the last 2 days become something closer to a vigil than an operations center, Captain Reyes was the one who caught the transmission first, and she nearly dropped the coffee mug in her hand. Say again, she said into her own radio voice, sharp with a hope she was almost afraid to let herself feel after 2 days of watching Colonel Whitaker second-guess a decision he couldn't take back. Checkpoint 7, say again, confirmed survivors. Confirmed. Okafor's voice, still shaking, came through clear this time. 6 survivors, Raven Creek crash on foot, multiple injuries requesting immediate medevac. 1 female specialist appears to be leading the group. She identified herself as Bennett, Claire Bennett. Reyes was already moving before the transmission, finished radio in one hand, sprinting across the command area toward Whitaker's tent, with a speed that startled 2 soldiers into scrambling out of her path. Sir! She burst through the tent, flap without knocking. Breathless, radio held out like an offering. Sir, Checkpoint 7, they're alive. All 6 of them. They walked out, sir. They walked out of that mountain on their own. Colonel Thomas Whitaker had not in 2 days managed to sleep more than an hour or 2 at a stretch. He had spent that time rewriting condolence letters. He couldn't finish staring at a thermal anomaly on Reyes's tablet that he'd refused to fully believe in, and carrying the particular specific weight of a decision that had felt necessary in the moment and had felt worse with every hour since. He stared at Reyes for a full 3 seconds before the words fully landed. All 6, he repeated, voice hollow. All 6, sir. Injured, some of them badly. There was a report of a systemic infection in one of the survivors that needs immediate attention, but they're alive. Sir, they walked out of Raven Creek, on foot, with injuries, in that storm. Reyes's voice cracked with something between disbelief and vindication. Bennett led them out, sir, Specialist Claire Bennett. Something in Whitaker's face went very still, very pale in a way Reyes had never seen from him in 11 months of service under his command. Bennett, he said quietly, almost to himself. The medic. Yes, sir. Whitaker was already reaching for his jacket, moving with a speed that belied 2 sleepless nights, every ounce of the careful, controlled composure he usually wore, stripped away by something that looked unmistakably like a man racing to outrun his own guilt. Get me transport to Checkpoint 7, he said. Now, and get medical assets moving the second we confirm the route's clear. I want to see this myself. Sir. Reyes hesitated just for a moment, something cautious in her voice. For what it's worth, I ran that thermal data because I didn't believe they were gone. I want you to know that wasn't insubordination. I know what it was, Captain. Whitaker's voice was rough, stripped of its usual command tent flatness. You were right and I was wrong, and standing here, arguing about the difference, isn't getting me any closer to that checkpoint. Move. The drive to Checkpoint 7 took 40 minutes that felt to Colonel Thomas Whitaker like the longest 40 minutes of his entire career. He sat in the back of the vehicle with his jaw locked tight, staring out at a landscape he had 2 days earlier written off as a graveyard, and felt every mile pass like an accusation. He had signed the order. He had said the words himself, flat and certain, into a radio that he now understood had been overheard by the very people he was condemning. Search is over. Bring the birds home. He had thought at the time that he was making the hard call, the responsible call, the call that protected the living, instead of gambling more lives chasing the dead. He had been wrong, not carelessly wrong, not incompetently wrong, but wrong in a way that 6 people had paid for anyway wrong, in a way that had nearly cost a sergeant his arm, and very nearly cost all 6 of them their lives wrong, in a way that no amount of sound military reasoning was going to fully excuse in his own mind. Not now, not ever, not after what Reyes had just told him. When the vehicle finally pulled into the checkpoint clearing, Whitaker was out of it before it had fully stopped moving. The scene that met him stopped him cold. Medical personnel were already swarming. Sergeant Foster, an IV line running into his arm, his face gray and slick with sweat, but his eyes open, tracking the activity around him, with the exhausted awareness of a man who understood finally that he was safe. Ryan Caldwell lay on a proper stretcher, now his splinted leg being assessed by a medic with careful professional hands, his face lined with 4 days of pain, but alert, watching everything with sharp, exhausted eyes. Douglas and Mason sat wrapped in emergency blankets, being checked for frostbite and exhaustion, Mason's color returning by the minute, now that real medical care had finally reached him. Alvarez stood a few feet away, blanket around his shoulders, staring at the scene with the dazed expression of someone who still couldn't quite believe he'd made it. And in the middle of it all, refusing every attempt by the medics to check her over first, was Claire Bennett, soaked, filthy, exhausted, past any reasonable limit, kneeling in the dirt beside a soldier who wasn't even hers to treat anymore, calmly explaining Foster's condition to the incoming medical team with the same flat, precise clarity she carried through 4 days of a nightmare most people would never have survived. Systemic infection onset roughly 48 hours ago. Fever spiked and broke twice in the last night alone, she was saying, not even looking up as Whitaker's vehicle came to a stop nearby. He needs broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately, and I want eyes on that arm within the hour. There's a real risk of losing it if the infection's gotten ahead of what field treatment could manage. Ma'am, we need to check you over too, one of the medics said gently. You look like you're barely standing. I'm fine, Claire said, in the exact same flat tone she'd used on that very first night in the wreckage when Ryan had asked her the same question. Foster isn't. Check him first. Whitaker stood at the edge of the clearing, unable for a long moment to make his feet carry him any closer. He was staring at a woman he had 2 days earlier mentally filed away as a name on a casualty report, a name he was fairly certain he hadn't even read closely before signing off a name that had existed in his mind, if it had existed at all, as an anonymous entry in a list of 6 people his decision had erased. And here she was, kneeling in the dirt, still working, still the last one thinking of herself, even now, even after everything. Ryan was the one who finally spotted him, and his voice cut across the clearing with a sharpness that made everyone turn. Colonel Whitaker. The clearing went quiet. Medics paused. Claire's head came up slowly, and for the first time her eyes found the man whose voice she had heard 4 days earlier, calmly signing all 6 of them off as dead over a crackling radio in the middle of a blizzard. Whitaker crossed the remaining distance on legs that felt to him distinctly unsteady for a man who had walked into far worse briefings without flinching. Captain Caldwell, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Sergeant Foster, specialist. He stopped in front of Claire, and something in his throat closed around the rest of the sentence. Bennett, Claire said quietly, finishing it for him, still on her knees in the dirt, still not standing still, watching him with an expression that gave away nothing of what 4 days of surviving his decision had cost her. Specialist Claire Bennett, we spoke once before, sir, briefly, during winter exercises last year. You probably don't remember. I don't, Whitaker admitted, and something about the honesty of it. No excuse, no deflection, just the flat truth seemed to cost him something to say out loud in front of his own soldiers. I'm ashamed to say I don't. Most people don't, Claire said, and there was no bitterness in it, only 4 days of hard-earned exhaustion and a truth she'd apparently made peace with long before this mountain. That's usually how I prefer it. Whitaker looked around the clearing at Ryan on the stretcher, at Foster hooked to an IV at Douglas and Mason and Alvarez, wrapped in blankets, all 6 of them alive. All 6 of them breathing, every single one of them a direct contradiction of the order he had given with his own voice 2 days earlier. I gave the order to suspend the search, he said quiet, and it wasn't an explanation, it was closer to a confession. I told command all 6 of you were presumed lost. I signed the paperwork. I was 2 hours from finishing the letters to your families. We heard, Claire said simply. Whitaker's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. You heard the transmission. 6 hours after the crash on a backup radio, Claire confirmed. We heard every word, sir. Search is over. Bring the birds home. She let that sit in the clearing for a moment, not cruel, not accusing, just true. It was for what it's worth the thing that made me realize nobody was coming for us, which meant we had exactly one option left. And you took it? Whitaker said something raw, breaking through the careful command tent composure he'd worn like armor for 2 straight days. You walked out, injured in a blizzard with a systemic infection eating through one of your men, and you walked all 6 of you out of that mountain because I told you no one was coming. That's about the shape of it, sir, Claire said. For a long moment, Colonel Thomas Whitaker simply stood there in a clearing 70 miles from the command tent where he'd made a decision he would carry for the rest of his career, staring down at a quiet, unremarkable specialist. He had never once in 8 months of shared service taken the time to truly see an understanding with a clarity that felt like it was reshaping something fundamental in his chest that he had been wrong about her in a way that went far beyond one bad call on one storm-blind night. He had been wrong about her since the very first day he'd failed to learn her name. "I need to know something," he said, finally, his voice quieter now, almost unsteady. How does a combat medic get 5 injured people through 40 miles of that terrain alone, with no radio, no support, and bring every single one of them out alive? That's not specialist. I've run recovery operations for 11 years. That's not something field training accounts for. Claire held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes. Not defiance, not pride, just a tired, quiet honesty that had been waiting 4 days longer than that, really, for someone to finally ask the right question. "There's a file, sir," she said. "One most people never get clearance to see. I'd imagine if someone were to actually read it, not skim it, actually read it, they'd find some answers in there that might surprise you." Whitaker looked at her for a long moment, and behind him, an intelligence officer who had followed the vehicle out from command, quiet until now, stepped forward with a sealed folder in his hands. Expression carefully neutral, in the way of someone delivering information he already understood was about to change everything. "Sir," the officer said, "Command pulled her personnel file the moment her name came through on the survivor manifest. Full clearance came back an hour ago. I think you're going to want to see this." Whitaker took the folder with hands that were for the first time in 2 days not entirely steady. He looked down at it, then back up at Claire Bennett, soaked, exhausted, still kneeling in the dirt beside a soldier who wasn't even her responsibility anymore. Still the same quiet, unremarkable name he had erased without a second thought 2 days earlier. "Specialist," he said slowly. "Who exactly did I have serving under my command for the last 8 months?" Claire didn't answer that directly. She simply held his gaze steady and unblinking, the same way she'd held it through an ice ledge and a raging river, and armed strangers moving through a valley in the dark, and let the folder in his hands answer the question instead. Whitaker opened it, and as his eyes moved down the first page, his face went through a transformation that every soldier in that clearing would describe for years afterward, in almost exactly the same words, the color draining out of it, the disbelief settling in, and beneath both of those things, something that looked unmistakably like the beginning of shame. Colonel Thomas Whitaker read the first page of that file standing in the mud of a checkpoint clearing, and by the second page his hands had gone still in a way that looked less like calm and more like a man forcing himself not to shake. "This can't be right," he said, not looking up. "This has to be a different Bennett." "It's not a different Bennett, sir," the intelligence officer said quietly. "Full clearance confirmed the identity 20 minutes ago. Specialist Claire Bennett, service number matches exactly." Whitaker turned another page, and Ryan, still flat on the stretcher, still watching everything with the sharp, exhausted focus of a man who'd learned 4 days ago never to look away from Claire Bennett when something important was happening, saw the exact moment the color left the colonel's face entirely. "4 confirmed extractions," Whitaker read aloud, his voice gone hollow, disbelieving. "Classified terrain recovery operations. 2 of them under conditions listed here as." He stopped, swallowed. "Extreme hostile environment. Single operator, led 0 support assets." He looked up, and his eyes found Claire's across the clearing, still kneeling in the mud beside Foster's or stretcher, still not standing still, not asking for a single thing for herself. "Specialist, this says you personally walked 11 people out of contested terrain in the Hindu Kush 3 years ago, alone, no backup, no extraction support for the first 60 hours. "That's accurate, sir," Claire said, and there was no pride in the way she said it. Only the same flat, tired honesty she'd carried through everything else this mountain had thrown at her. 11 people, Whitaker repeated, like the number itself refused to settle into anything he could fully process. "You were 24 years old." 23, sir. I turned 24 somewhere on day 2 of that extraction, as I recall. Nobody had cake. A ragged, disbelieving laugh broke out of Douglas before he could stop it, and even Foster Gray, and weak on his IV line, managed a faint, exhausted grin at that. But Whitaker didn't laugh. Whitaker stood very still, turning page after page of a file that rewrote everything he thought he understood about the quiet, unremarkable medic he had served alongside for 8 months without once learning her first name properly. Why she hate? Bourgeois, he said finally, and it came out rougher than he intended, closer to something wounded than something commanding. Why would someone with this record ask for a transfer to a standard infantry support unit, checking equipment, organizing supply closets? Specialist, this is, he gestured helplessly at the file. This is a waste of everything you are capable of. Claire was quiet for a long moment. When she finally answered, her voice had lost its usual clinical flatness, and something underneath it, something old, something that had clearly been sitting unspoken for a long time, rose to the surface for the first time since the crash. The 11th person I pulled out of that valley in the Hindu Kush didn't make it, sir, she said. Not the mission. He survived the mission. He made it home. And 6 months later, he put a gun in his mouth in his parents' garage because nobody in that classified program was equipped to help any of us carry what we'd seen, and I was the one who found out because I was the only person from the extraction team who still answered his calls. Her jaw tightened, the only visible sign of what the memory cost her. After that, I asked for the transfer. I didn't want to stop serving. I just didn't want to keep doing the kind of serving where the people you save don't always survive saving themselves afterward. I wanted something quiet, something where I could still help people one bandage at a time without carrying the weight of an entire extraction on my back every single day. The clearing had gone completely silent. Even the medics working on Foster had slowed, caught in the gravity of what Claire had just admitted out loud for the first time to 6 people, and a colonel who had until an hour ago believed her to be nothing more than a name on a casualty list. I'm sorry, Whitaker said, and it came out raw, unguarded. Nothing like the clipped command tent voice that had signed off on 6 deaths 2 days earlier. I am deeply sorry, Specialist. Not just for the search, for 8 months of not knowing who was serving under my command. For a file I should have read the day you transferred in and never did. For assuming that quiet meant nothing important was happening underneath it. Claire held his gaze for a long moment, and when she finally answered, there was no anger in it, only a kind of tired, hard-won clarity that carried more weight than anger ever could have. You're not the first commander to make that mistake, sir, she said. You probably won't be the last, but for what it's worth. She glanced around the clearing at Ryan on the stretcher at Foster, hooked to his IV, at Douglas and Mason and Alvarez, all of them watching her now with an entirely different kind of attention than they'd ever paid her before the crash. These men know now. That's worth something. Maybe it's worth more than you reading a file 2 days too late. Whitaker absorbed that in silence, and something in his posture changed. Not broken exactly, but reshaped the careful command tent composure, giving way to something more honest underneath it. He did not salute her then. That would come later, and it would mean more for having waited. Right then, he simply crouched down beside her in the mud, ignoring every instinct of rank and protocol, or that would have kept a colonel standing while a specialist knelt and looked her in the eye at the same level. Tell me what you need, he said. Right now, not for the report, not for the record. What do you need, Specialist Bennett? Claire studied him for a moment, surprised clearly by the question, by the shift in him. Get Foster on that helicopter first, she said. He's got maybe another day before that infection wins something he can't get back. Everything else can wait. Foster's already loading, the lead medic confirmed, and as if summoned by the words, the sergeant was lifted onto the waiting evacuation helicopter, IV line swaying, his one good hand lifting weakly in something between a wave and a salute toward the group he was leaving behind. Hey, Bennett, Foster called out, voice thin but carrying. You still owe me an explanation for how a supply closet medic learned to read a river crossing like she'd built the thing herself. Get better first, Claire called back, and something that might have been real warmth broke through the exhaustion on her face. Then I'll tell you everything. The helicopter lifted off in a roar of rotor wash and swirling dust, carrying Foster toward the surgical care that would 3 weeks later save both his life and his arm, a fact the entire unit would eventually learn came down to a matter of hours, hours that existed only because Claire Bennett had refused to let a river or a mountain or 4 days of exhaustion slow her down even once. Ryan went up next, his splinted leg finally receiving the kind of medical attention it had needed since the moment the helicopter went down. and as the medics lifted his stretcher toward the second evacuation aircraft, he caught Claire's sleeve with one hand holding her there for just a moment longer. "Hey." His voice was rough, but there was something fierce underneath the exhaustion. Something that needed saying before the two of them were separated into different hospital wings and different debriefings and different versions of a story that had somehow, over 4 impossible days, become the most important thing either of them had ever lived through. "I don't know how to say thank you for something this big. There isn't a version of thank you that covers what you did." "You don't have to say anything," Claire said. "I'm going to anyway." Ryan held her gaze unflinching despite the pain radiating up through his leg. "You kept 6 people alive on a mountain that had already buried us on paper. You went back into a river for a man who doubted you for 2 straight days. You fought an infection with your bare hands and a fire that could barely stay lit. Whatever they called you before this quiet mile, I don't think that name's ever going to be quiet again. Not after this." Claire's composure, which had held through crashes in rivers and armed strangers and a nearly fatal infection, finally cracked just slightly. Just for a moment, her eyes bright, her jaw tight against something that looked for the first time in 4 days like it might actually be tears. "Get some rest, Captain," she said, voice thick. "That's an order from a specialist, which I realize doesn't technically outrank you, but I've earned it this week." "Yes, ma'am," Ryan said, and managed a real exhausted smile as the medics lifted him aboard. By the time the last of the survivors, Douglas Mason and Alvarez, walking under their own power, now wrapped in blankets and supported by medics, who kept glancing at them like they were witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible, had been loaded and cleared for transport, Claire Bennett was for the first time in 4 days standing alone. Whitaker approached her one final time before the last helicopter lifted off, and something in his bearing had changed completely from the man who had signed a casualty report 2 days earlier without a second thought. "There's going to be an inquiry," he said, "into the decision to suspend the search. I want you to know that before it happens, so it doesn't blindside you when the questions start." "I won't lie in the inquiry, sir," Claire said, steady, unflinching. "But I also won't pretend the decision was made in bad faith. You had a storm grounding your aircraft and no confirmation of survivors. I understand the math you were working with. I don't have to agree with the outcome to understand how you got there." "That's more grace than I probably deserve," Whitaker said quietly. "Maybe," Claire said, "but it's also just true, sir. I've made hard calls with incomplete information before. I know what that costs a person making them. I'm not interested in adding to that pain unnecessarily." Whitaker studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked unmistakably like a man reevaluating every assumption he'd built his career on. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I don't think I'm ever going to sign off on a search suspension again without personally verifying every scrap of information available first. You taught me that today, whether you meant to or not." "Good," Claire said simply. "That's worth something too." The final helicopter lifted off into a sky that had, over the course of that single impossible day, cleared from gray to something almost blue, almost gentle, as though the mountain itself had finally decided to stop fighting them, now that the fight was over. Claire watched it go, then turned to find Whitaker still standing there, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She didn't know it yet, but that expression would follow her and him for years. The official inquiry into the Raven Creek search suspension took 11 weeks, and it was, by every account from everyone involved, one of the more unusual proceedings in the history of that command. Colonel Thomas Whitaker did not attempt to defend his decision as flawless. He stood before the review board and stated plainly that he had made the call with the information available, that the information available had been incomplete, and that 6 lives had survived his error only because one soldier under his command had refused to accept the verdict he'd handed down. "I want the record to reflect," Whitaker told the board in testimony that would later be quoted almost word for word in 3 different service publications, that Specialist Claire Bennett's survival and leadership under conditions had already declared unsurvivable represents an extraordinary act that exists entirely outside the normal boundaries of her role. I recommend her for the highest commendation this command is capable of awarding, and I state for the record that my own error in judgment should in no way diminish the magnitude of what she accomplished in spite of it. It was several officers who witnessed the testimony would later say the most honest thing anyone had ever seen a colonel say about his own mistake in an official inquiry. Claire's testimony when it came was shorter, quieter, and carried none of the drama the board had perhaps expected from the woman at the center of a story that had by then begun circulating through the entire command in versions increasingly embellished with each retelling. "I didn't do anything special," she told the board flat and matter-of-fact in a statement that would frustrate several officers who clearly wanted a more compelling narrative for their report. "I used training I already had to get 5 injured men through terrain I understood better than most people would have. Colonel Whitaker made a decision with the information he had. I made a decision with the information I had. Neither of us was wrong to trust our own judgment. I was fortunate that mine turned out to be right." Specialist one board member pressed, "You're describing a 4-day, 40-mile evacuation through hostile winter terrain with multiple life-threatening medical crises as nothing special." "I'm describing it as something I was trained on, sir," Claire said. "Special implies luck. This wasn't luck. This was preparation meeting circumstance. I'd rather the record reflect that accurately than turn it into something it wasn't." The board in the end awarded her the commendation Whitaker had recommended, along with a formal citation that used words like extraordinary heroism and singular leadership. Under extreme duress, words Claire would later admit privately made her deeply uncomfortable every time she heard them read aloud. But the thing that changed more than any medal, more than any formal citation, was something quieter. Something that spread through the entire command in the weeks and months that followed, carried not by official channels, but by the 6 people who had walked out of Raven Creek Mountain and had never not once stopped talking about the woman who had brought them home. Douglas requested a permanent reassignment to Claire's section 3 months later, a request that surprised absolutely nobody who had watched the two of them cross that river together. "I spent 2 days doubting her," he told anyone who asked why. 2 days questioning every decision she made, wondering what she was hiding, treating her like she owed me an explanation for keeping us alive. I'm not making that mistake twice. If Bennett's leading something, I want to be following it. Alvarez, the 19-year-old private who had nearly gone off the ice ledge, requested medic training himself within the year, citing in his application a single sentence that Claire had said to him on that mountain, a sentence he'd apparently carried with him every single day since, "You're not dying on this ledge. Not today, not on my watch." "I want to be able to say that to somebody someday," he wrote, "and mean it the way she meant it." Mason Brooks, once fully recovered, made a habit of visiting the aid station every week, ostensibly for a checkup that had long since stopped being medically necessary, and stayed for coffee and conversation with the medic who had fought his fever back from the edge of something none of them liked to name out loud. "She saved my life twice," he told Ryan once years later at a reunion none of them had ever expected to have reason to hold. "Once on the mountain pulling me out of the snow, and once after when she kept talking to me through that fever, kept giving me a reason to stay conscious. I don't know how you thank somebody for that. I've been trying for years." Foster, after 3 weeks of surgery and recovery that saved both his life and against long odds, his arm tracked down Claire's contact information the moment he was discharged and left a voicemail that Claire kept unerased for the rest of her career. "Bennett, it's Foster. Doctors say I'm gonna keep the arm. Full function eventually, they think. I wanted you to hear it from me before it hit any report. Emma's already planning to tell her whole kindergarten class her dad got saved by a real-life superhero. I told her superheroes wear capes, not medic bags, and she told me I was wrong. And honestly, kids got a point. Thank you for all of it. I mean that in every way a person can mean 2 words." Ryan Caldwell, once his leg healed enough to return to duty, requested and received a transfer to a training command where he spent the next several years teaching young officers a single lesson. He built an entire curriculum around a lesson he never once let anyone forget where it had come from. "The most capable person in your unit is not always the loudest one," he told every new class of officers year after year. "Sometimes they're the quiet mede who organizes your supply closet and never says a word about what they're truly capable of. If you don't take the time to know your people, really know them, not just their rank, not just their file summary, but who they actually are, you will make the same mistake a colonel I served under made. You will write off the one person capable of saving all of you simply because you never bothered to look closely enough to see it coming." And Colonel Thomas Whitaker, the man who had signed 6 lives away, with 11 words and a storm-blind decision, became over the years that followed something almost unrecognizable from the commander who had once made that call without a second thought. He read every file now, Every single one in full the day a new soldier transferred into his command, regardless of how junior, how unremarkable, how quiet they might appear on paper. He asked questions in every briefing that he had never thought to ask before Raven Creek. Not just what do we know, but who do we have and what haven't we bothered to find out about them yet? Who knows, something we haven't considered. Became over time something close to a personal motto, a question he asked at the start of nearly every operational briefing for the remainder of his career. A question that had been born entirely out of the 11 weeks of humbling self-reflection that followed the day he'd nearly buried 6 people alive because he'd never bothered to learn the name of the quiet medic in his own command. Claire Bennett, for her part, never sought out any of the recognition that followed her out of those mountains. She declined 3 separate offers to transfer back into classified recovery operations, citing the same reasons she'd given the review board that she preferred quiet, steady work over the kind of high-stakes missions that had once before cost her more than she was willing to pay again. She stayed in Whitaker's command for another 2 years, quietly excellent at everything she did, quietly unremarkable in every way except to the 6 people who understood better than anyone else alive exactly what she was capable of when circumstances demanded it. It was at Colonel Thomas Whitaker's retirement ceremony, nearly 6 years after the Raven Creek crash, that the story finally reached the audience it perhaps always deserved. Not a review board, not an official inquiry, but hundreds of soldiers gathered under a gray autumn sky to honor a career that was by every measure distinguished, decorated, and in the eyes of the man receiving the honor permanently marked by one decision he had never stopped carrying. Whitaker stood at the podium in his dress uniform medals, catching the pale light, and instead of the polished, safe retirement speech everyone had expected, the kind full of gratitude and career highlights and careful diplomatic nods to everyone who deserved thanking, he did something almost nobody in that audience anticipated. He told them about Raven Creek. 6 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clear and steady across a silent parade ground. I made a decision that I have thought about in some form nearly every single day since. I signed an order suspending a search for 6 soldiers whose helicopter had gone down in a storm I believe made rescue impossible. I told command all 6 were presumed dead. I began writing letters to their families. He paused, and the silence in that crowd had a weight to it that only comes from hundreds of people realizing simultaneously that they were about to hear something that mattered. I was wrong, he said simply. Not carelessly wrong, not incompetently wrong. I made that call with the best information available to me at the time, and I would defend the process behind that decision to any board that asked me to. But I was wrong nonetheless, because 6 people were alive on that mountain, and one of them a quiet, unremarkable specialist I am ashamed to admit I had served alongside for 8 months without ever learning to see, clearly refused to accept the verdict I had handed down. He told them the whole story then. The crash, the dead pilot, the broken leg, the shattered arm, the missing private thrown from the wreckage. The transmission 6 survivors overheard calmly signing them all away as already lost. The ice ledge, the river, the armed strangers moving through the valley in the dark, the infection that had nearly cost a sergeant his arm and very nearly cost him his life. 4 days, 40 miles, one woman who had refused from the very first hour to let a colonel's decision become anyone's final word. Her name, Whitaker said, his voice thick with something he made no effort to hide, was Claire Bennett. Her call sign from a classified career most of us never knew existed until the day she walked out of those mountains was Quiet Mile. And I want every officer in this audience, every young leader standing on this field today, to understand exactly what that name meant and exactly why I failed for 8 straight months to see it standing right in front of me. He looked out at the crowd, and somewhere near the back, standing quietly, unassumingly, the way she had always stood in every room she'd ever entered, was Claire Bennett herself, no longer in uniform, having transitioned out of active service the year before, but present invited the guest of honor Whitaker had insisted on having at his own retirement ceremony. Leadership, Whitaker continued, his eyes finding hers across the field, is not about being the loudest voice in the room or the highest rank on the roster or the person whose name gets remembered first when a briefing ends. Leadership is having the humility to ask who knows something we haven't considered, and then actually listening when the answer comes from somewhere you weren't expecting it. I learned that lesson from a woman who never once asked for recognition, never once demanded to be seen, and saved 6 lives anyway, simply because it was the right thing to do. and she happened to be the only person capable of doing it. He stepped down from the podium, then in front of hundreds of soldiers, in front of a career's worth of colleagues and subordinates and commanding officers who had gathered to honor his service, and walked directly toward Claire Bennett, standing quiet and unassuming at the edge of the crowd, exactly the way she had always stood. And in front of everyone, in front of Ryan Caldwell, who had flown in for the ceremony and stood watching with tears he made no effort to hide. In front of Douglas and Mason and Alvarez, who had all traveled from different corners of the country because none of them would have missed this for anything. In front of Foster, whose arm had healed fully, who lifted that same arm now to wipe his own eyes as he watched what was about to happen. Colonel Thomas Whitaker came to a stop in front of the woman he had once, without a second thought, declared dead. And he raised his hand and he saluted her. Not because she outranked him. She didn't. Not because protocol demanded it. It didn't. Not because anyone in that crowd expected it, or because any regulation required a retiring colonel to salute a former specialist standing quietly at the edge of a ceremony that wasn't even hers. He saluted her because she had earned it in a way that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the kind of quiet, unshakable courage that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, doesn't wait for permission to do what needs to be done. He saluted her because 6 men were alive who shouldn't have been, because a sergeant still had both arms, because a 19-year-old private had learned that someone could look him in the eye on the edge of a cliff and mean it when they said, "You're not dying today," because an entire command had learned through one woman's refusal to accept a death sentence that wasn't hers to accept, that the person capable of saving everyone is sometimes the one nobody bothered to notice standing quietly in the corner of the room. Claire held that salute for a long moment. Her composure, the same composure that had carried her through a helicopter crash, in a river crossing, in a fever that nearly claimed a man's life in her own 2 hands, finally completely breaking, tears sliding down her face in front of hundreds of witnesses, in front of 6 men who owed her everything, in front of a colonel who had spent 6 years learning to see her clearly. Then she returned the salute steady despite the tears, the same steady hands that had splinted broken bones and packed snow against a raging fever and hauled a drowning man out of a current that nearly took them both. "Thank you, sir," she said, quiet enough that only those closest could hear it, for finally reading the file. "Thank you," Whitaker answered, his voice breaking on the words, "for walking out of that mountain when I told you not to bother." The applause that followed lasted nearly a full minute, hundreds of soldiers on their feet, and somewhere in that crowd, Ryan Caldwell turned to Douglas, both men wiping their eyes without any pretense of hiding it, and said the only thing that felt big enough to hold everything that moment meant. 6 years, Ryan said. 6 years, and he finally got to say it out loud. "Some debts take that long to pay," Douglas said. "Doesn't make them any less real when they finally get paid." Claire Bennett never became famous beyond that ceremony. Never chased medals or headlines or the kind of recognition that follows people who want to be seen. She went on in the years afterward to build a quiet civilian life, training combat medics on wilderness survival and emergency field care, teaching a new generation of soldiers the same skills that had once carried 5 injured men and herself through 40 miles of impossible mountain terrain. She rarely told the full story herself. She let the 6 men who had walked beside her carry it, instead told and retold at reunions and dinner tables, and eventually in interviews and articles that spread the name Quiet Mile far beyond the small circle of people who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a soldier who organized supply closets and kept to herself. But those who had walked beside her through Raven Creek Mountain, who had watched her wade into a freezing river alone to test a crossing before asking anyone else to risk it, who had felt her hand steady and sure against a broken leg while a storm screamed outside a rock overhang, who had heard her voice cut through their own fear on an ice ledge with a promise she made absolutely certain to keep, never forgot the truth that mountain had taught every single one of them. The soldier the Army had marked as killed in action was the same soldier who walked 5 men back home alive against odds that should have killed all 6 of them, against a decision that had already declared them dead before she ever gave anyone the chance to prove otherwise. And the colonel who had signed that decision, who had once believed a quiet medic incapable of anything more than checking equipment and handing out bandages, became the very first person in that entire command, in front of hundreds of witnesses, in front of a career's worth of pride. He set aside without hesitation to stand up, raise his hand and salute her, not because rank demanded it, because she had earned it. And that, more than any medal, more than any classified file, more than any official commendation, read aloud at a review board months after the mountain had already tried and failed to break her. That single salute offered freely by a man who had once left her for dead was the truest measure of everything Claire Bennett had proven on Raven Creek Mountain and everything she would go on proving quietly, steadily, for the rest of a life spent making certain that nobody she was responsible for ever walked into the dark alone.